Hello and welcome to the launch of the report Opposition to Gender Equality in the Nordic Countries, Encounters with Anti-Gender Politics Across Civil Society, Academia and Government. My name is Hanna Onwen-Huma. I work at the Ministry for Social Affairs and Health here in Finland, and I had the honor of being in the lead of the Finnish chairmanship of the Nordic Council of Ministers last year, 2025. We are currently witnessing a global pushback against gender equality, and the report published today gives us a preliminary snapshot of the situation in the Nordic countries when it comes to opposition towards gender equality and promoting gender equality. The report has been prepared by Associate Professor Julian Honkasalo, and the work was commissioned by the Council for Gender Equality in Finland, which is also known as Tane, and the Coalition of Finnish Women's Associations, also known as NYTKIS. You can access the report via the QR code, which you can see on the screen. Today's event, as well as the report, has been funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers as part of the Finnish presidency in the Council during 2025. The Nordic Council of Ministers has been working for pushing for progress for some years now. Here's some information about the declaration that the gender equality and LGBTI ministers in the Nordic countries made, stating that the Nordic governments stand united in one shared vision to safeguard universal human rights, to make sure gender equality prevails in all areas of society, and to empower women and girls everywhere. The ministers stated in the declaration that they are deeply concerned with the growing global resistance, regression and pushback against gender equality and equal rights. Ministers continued to say that they remain fully committed to ensuring women and girls in all their diversity full enjoyment of their rights, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. And they vowed to defend the advancements already made, to never go back and to keep on pushing for progress. And with this declaration, the Nordic Council of Ministers has actively addressed the global anti-gender movement. As we all know, we have a very long-standing commitment to advancing equality and human rights. Nordic countries together have been working collectively to safeguard women's and girls, and as well also the LGBTI rights, pushing back against the false narratives that we see more and more, and promote evidence-based and rights-based policies. In the Pushing for Progress program, the Nordic governments utilized the framework from the declaration and from the international alliances. We try to reach the so-called middle ground countries, mobilize global support, and reinforce multilateral agreements at the UN forums. Also, working together with the civil society organizations is a very big part of this Pushing for Progress program. And one of the very important aspects has also been the cooperation between the Ministries for Gender Equality and the Ministries for Foreign Affairs. And with this work, the Nordic Council of Ministers is trying to push for progress instead of giving in for going backwards with gender equality. But now let's move on to the next, not the next speaker yet, but to the program. First, Julian Honkasalo will present the key findings of the report. Following that, we will have 3 commentaries from 3 Nordic countries. We will have Associate Professor Cristian Norocel from Lund University in Sweden, Professor Tuija Saresma from University of Eastern Finland, from Finland of course, and then Managing Director Auður Önnu Magnúsdóttir from the Icelandic Women's Rights Association in Iceland. In the end, we have a little bit of time for a discussion, and before giving the floor to our first speaker, a few words about the practicalities, some housekeeping rules. A chat function is available during the webinar for comments and discussion. And in accordance with our principles for a safer space, the chat is moderated, and hate speech, harassment, or any other inappropriate conduct is not permitted. We kindly ask all of the attendees to engage in respectful and constructive discussion. Also note that recording, filming, copying, sharing, publishing, distributing, or any other unauthorized use of the webinar or any part of it is strictly prohibited. And this is all from me. And now, Julian, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. I will now present some of the key findings of the study. So opposition to gender equality work is widespread and prevalent across civil society, academia, and government. Across all Nordic countries, reported incidents include threats of legal measures, doxing, threats of violence, stalking, and attempts to discredit gender equality expertise. Recurring online intimidation and discursive pushback in particular are associated with increasing self-censorship and pressure to alter or avoid gender equality terminology, including among government officials. The findings suggest that the opposition documented in this study cannot be explained solely by legitimate democratic contestation or differences in political values or viewpoints. In Nordic societies, freedom of speech, religious freedom, freedom of assembly are respected values and rights. However, as the report shows, this is not legitimate opposition because it takes the form of harassment and violence. Where opposition appears to be coordinated, it may constitute a hybrid security concern. Possible foreign influence and funding needs further research. So what is the encountered opposition like? If you look at the graph here, you can see that 52% of all the respondents had experienced opposition directed towards their organization, 44% towards individuals or an employee in the organization, whereas 35% responded none of the above. 52% had experienced threats or harassment against their organization, and 44% on an individual level. And I will walk through what this was in more concrete. Of the reported threats and harassment, 35% occurred face-to-face, 67% through phone calls and emails, and 93% through social media platforms. So although digital harassment is the most prevalent form of opposition, 35% have occurred also face-to-face. 44% of the respondents reported threats of harassment during events organized by the respondent or their organization, and 42% threats of legal measures against the respondent or their organization. Furthermore, 25% experienced unauthorized online distribution of personal or sensitive information with deliberate intent to harm, which is called doxing, and this is a serious violation of privacy and rights. 19% reported stalking or persecution, which possibly fills the criteria of criminal activity, and 16% death threats. 12% threats to family members' health and safety. So these are serious concerns. I will read some of the quotations from the open section of the respondents. Here's one respondent from a civil society organization who says, "The main opposition comes online, comments on posts on social media or contacting us through our messenger, distribution of photos that have been changed, writing articles about me to undermine the work I do and stand for and my organization." Here's an academic respondent. "Smearing campaigns on various platforms, letters to employer, politicians, funders. Oral attacks on my credibility as a researcher in public meetings where I'm not present. Op-eds in major newspapers as well as social media and alt-right platforms. And this is an academic in sociology and gender studies. And finally, one citation from a government sector respondent. As a ministry, we face the opposition daily in multilateral fora and also in certain country contexts. So what is the impact of this kind of opposition that has been reported? In this study, we also had questions where we were trying to find out what is the possible impact of facing this form of harassment. Across all respondents, nearly half, 48%, reported that opposition to gender equality work negatively affects their sense of emotional safety as well as their mental and physical well-being. So this constitutes a work, occupational, and health issue. As a result, 26% of participants reported withdrawing from work-related tasks, including public appearances and advocacy activities. So one of the most serious impacts is withdrawal from public discussion and public appearance, but also carrying out the kind of work that these organizations and agents are supposed to be doing. In order to avoid intimidation, respondents described taking precautionary measures or limiting their engagement, particularly on specific issues. 29% reported that they limited this in relation to gender equality issues in general. So then the question rises, how are you supposed to be carrying out gender equality work if you need to be careful to use internationally ratified gender equality terms in general? 19% concerning sexual and reproductive health and rights or comprehensive sexuality education, 18% regarding sexual and gender-based violence, and 16% in relation to violence against women and girls. I will take you back once more to the previous slide. So here you can see that these respondents are limiting their ability to work with quite basic gender equality work. And when we look into more specific questions about what kind of topics are mostly avoided, you can see that LGBT rights constitutes 46%. However, as you can see, gender equality issues in general is 29%. And there are also violence against women and girls, human rights in general, anti-racism, and other forms of topics that these gender equality experts need to be precautious with in order to avoid intimidation or harassment or threats to life. Finally, when we want to look at the Nordic context in specific, why was this report done? Why are we looking at the Nordic context? Well, previous research in Europe from over 10 years has already established in academic scholarship that opposition against gender equality and LGBT rights and human rights related to this kind of work has been targeted and opposed. In 2017, Roman Kuhar and David Paternot published an anthology called Anti-Gender Campaigns in Europe. And in this work in 2017, they actually did not look at the Nordic context in particular, because this area wasn't specifically an interest. It wasn't a high-risk area to study. In 2021, Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk published Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Movement, where they also looked at Sweden as an example. So we can see how these kind of rhetorical discourses that these two books have been studying seem to be navigating towards the Nordic context. Well, the Nordic societies are quite unique. They're characterized by high institutional trust. This is one of the strengths of Nordic societies. Consensus-oriented political culture in general, even though we have multiple parliamentary structures. Nordic countries are also role models in gender equality and education. In the Nordic context, it seems that hybrid influence operations primarily amplify existing societal and political divisions. And you can see this when you read the report and you look at something called discursive opposition. So where there are some cracks, hybrid influencing can amplify these kind of divisions. And then repeated polarization attempts through discursive opposition may weaken social cohesion and resilience, possibly creating opportunities for foreign-funded influence. And one of the key takeaways of the study for further reflection and discussion is that according to the survey results, it seems that this area is something that should be paid attention to. When multiple forms of opposition often emerge simultaneously across different platforms, they're reinforcing one another and amplifying their overall impact. Then in these specific contexts, we can't talk anymore and justify this kind of rhetoric by the fact that this is just an example of the fact that we have different kinds of political opinions or we have different kinds of political values. As I said previously, freedom of speech, religious freedom, all of these are highly valuable and respected values and political rights and human rights in the Nordic context. But when you are looking at hybrid forms of targeting and opposition, we are possibly dealing with a security issue. So how do we move forward from this? The results provide a preliminary snapshot and a starting point for discussion. And I want to emphasize this. This is a survey report. It's a preliminary snapshot of something that we wanted to look at. However, funding is needed for a larger Nordic follow-up research project, a proper research project, well-funded, possibly lasting a couple of years. And it's not just a matter of disagreement or democratically legitimate political opinions. However, what I want to stress is that it might be a wider concern for Nordic values and democracies. And there's a section in the report called Democratic Backsliding that you can look at. Opposition to gender equality across all studied sectors in the Nordic region should be taken seriously as a possible, broader, hybrid security concern. Many organizations have already response plans, but preventive support systems remain insufficient. So it's time to act and plan and fund these kind of support systems before anything happens, before these organizations are being targeted. And emphasize that this is a occupational health issue, it's a safety issue, and it's a possible security concern in terms of externally funded hybrid influence. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Very concerning news and information. Next, we will hear from Cristian Norocel from University of Lund, Sweden. Cristian will reflect more on the impact of the opposition to gender equality and the impacts of it to democracy. The floor is yours, Cristian.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure now to present some of my comments and interventions concerning this report. And since at the moment I happen to be locally in Helsinki, I will try to emulate my hosts and present you with three important points, following the example of the Finnish President Alexander Stubb, hoping that these remarks will be following through to the discussion. So the first point would be to underline the fact that democracy and gender equality are something very specific in the Nordic context, and the decay and the quality, the decreasing quality of one would have a negative impact on the other. The second comment that I would like to make concerns this issue of looking at gender equality endeavors from an intersectional standpoint, from an inclusive standpoint, that also pays attention not only to the gender-specific issues that pertain to women, but also to issues that pertain to LGBTQI community, as well as young men and boys in general, and racialized communities. And the third point would be what I would name the slippery slope that leads, for instance, from disinformation, false information, to dehumanization, to incitement to violence, and then eventually to violent acts. This being said, I would like to delve a bit more into detail into these elements. So to return to the first one, the interaction, as I see it, the very deep connection between our democratic societies and the way of organizing our societies here in Northern Europe and gender equality endeavors. And I would say that this element, it's very important because, as we could see in the findings of the report, several of both civil society actors as well as academics and government officials have signaled the fact that the type of violence directed at them determines them to withdraw from the public eye, limiting their public engagement. And this actually is a worrying sign for our societies, because we have built into the way we have constructed our institutions, we build on trust, we build on consensus. So the moments when people that have a lot of expertise on these issues do not dare to come forward to present their findings, to present their opinions, to help to have better policies, to have better ways of addressing the challenges that we are facing, both internally as individual country, but also as societies in a wider context, are actually having a negative impact, and that would lead to democratic decay that will impact negatively every single member of our Nordic societies. The second point that I would like to emphasize in this context is trying to go beyond very narrow understandings of gender equality policies. And in here, I would like to emphasize the fact that an intersectional understanding of gender equality policy, that one that pays attention to issues of the dynamic, the complex dynamic, and it's important to underline this fact that we cannot simplify everything to black and white, to only plus and minus type of thinking. So the intersectional perspective on gender equality is one that pays attention to the dynamic between issues of gender, issues of sexuality, race, social class, and ability, that in a sense, in this context, is not by any way excluding any issues that deal with matters that pertain, for instance, to the young men and the men in Nordic societies. Yes, so this intersectionality is the one that allows us to understand and to help us address these common challenges that we are facing. So very narrow and very limited understandings of this kind of policies would only lead to silo thinking and to isolation and, if you wish, even further polarization on very important matters. And the last aspect that I wanted to discuss here pertains to this issue of the slippery slope. Very often it has been said, and I have also been at the short end of things, if you wish, in terms of being able to put up with what is called an energetic discussion. Unfortunately, I'm not talking, and we are definitely in general as both academics, but also as civil society, we are not talking about an honest and democratic and civilized discussion. Most of the times, what I have identified both in my research, but also that the report is lifting up, is this slippery slope from starting from what I would call dishonest interpretation of research findings, for example, in my case, that could very easily lead to dehumanizing of the researchers doing this type of important research, and then being manifest very easily into various forms of doxing, as Julian was mentioning a bit earlier, but also digital violence in several forms that very easily can lead to, as you could see in the report, to acts of physical violence, acts of persecution, and so on and so forth. So these are having serious chilling effects on both representatives from the civil society as well as academics, but also government representatives. And then here, perhaps what is important to underline is that we need to understand that Nordic democracy is not a shouting game. It's not the situation in which whoever shouts louder is the one that is listened and has more legitimacy. It is a context in which we are coming and we are presenting our positions. And of course, some of us have a certain expertise that we have built upon year upon year upon year. And the only thing that puts us together is exactly the fact that we are wanting to design together a common Nordic project, a project that has gender equality endeavors at its core. With this being said, I will finalize my intervention by saying a trilingual thank you, kiitos, tack.
Thank you very, very much, Cristian. Next, we will go over to Professor Tuija Saresma from the University of Eastern Finland, and she will be sharing her thoughts about anti-gender mobilization as a threat to the academic freedom. Tuija, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here discussing this very important report after my brilliant colleagues Julian and Cristian. So I'm going to talk about this report of the perspective of the academic community. And as it says in the report, academics across the Nordic countries reported encountering opposition in many forms. 47% of the respondents reported threats or harassment directed at themselves or an individual employee, and 26% reported threats or harassment both on an organizational and individual level. So there is a really high incidence of online harassment, smear campaigns, doxing, legal threats, and threats to academic freedom as a whole. And what is noteworthy is that gender studies scholars were disproportionately targeted based on this survey. This is not, sadly, a surprise, because we are witnessing global trends of anti-intellectualism intertwined with authoritarian movements and radical populist right or far-right politics. And there's quite an impressive amount of research on these topics. What I think that one of the key things for the academic community that this report reveals is that Nordic universities are by no means immune to attacks on academic freedom. And this is true particularly in relation to scholars working on intersectional gender equality and anti-racism. So the open-ended responses described severe forms of intimidation and opposition, including witnessing the burning of pride flags, a threat involving a fake explosive device, a bomb, and attempts to delegitimize or discredit the target's employer or funding agency. But there were notable differences that were observed among respondent groups. And the academics experienced pressure to self-censor, undermining academic freedom. So this is something to really worry about. The Academic Freedom Index is measured with these five things: freedom to research and teach, freedom of academic exchange and dissemination, institutional autonomy, campus integrity, which means protection from violence and harassment, and freedom of academic and cultural expression. And sadly, there has been a dramatic drop in academic freedom index in Finland during the last couple of years. The drop was like 38 points, actually. We are now at the stage 47 in the countries in the world. And one of the reasons for this dramatic drop is the increased external threat that universities and university people face, for example, harassment. So 83% of academics had encountered the allegation that gender equality researchers and experts are biased or not legitimate. And this makes me wonder whether there's a systematic misrepresentation campaign of researchers going on that is discrediting their expertise. And why this is dangerous? Because harassment of teachers and researchers truly limits academic freedom and freedom of speech. The report, there were reported experiences of degradation, defamation, and even bomb threats targeting academics. Self-censorship emerges as a consequence to these, and it is both an impact and a coping mechanism among academics. Harassment of teachers and researchers, that is actually, we witness that in growing numbers in the Nordics as well. They include smear campaigns, false allegations of research bias, hate speech, and even physical threats. Academic researchers become the focus of coordinated attacks, particularly on social media. And we are witnessing public targeting and ridicule of funding decisions and funding organizations. And the aim of all of this is, of course, to silence academics. And there's quite a broad selection of studies that sort of back these the findings of this report. So when we look at the case in sort of a broader context, we can see that populist politics of knowledge is affecting people in the academia. And there are various kinds of effects. A very dangerous thing is the chilling effect on researchers, which means that researchers start censoring themselves. They are not willing to talk about their research in public, or even worse, they don't even start doing research on the on the topics that they find interesting or important because of the chilling effect. There is distortion of research agendas, which of course means that it's eroding the academic freedom. It affects on the trust in science that people have, and it impacts funding structures as well. So over time, these pressures can result in gaps in knowledge production. And such developments can subtly but profoundly reshape what knowledge is produced, who produces it, and under what conditions. So what can we do to protect academic freedom, freedom of speech, and liberal democracy? We need more in-depth research on anti-gender mobilization and research on attacks against academic freedom. We need mental and structural support for the victims of attacks. We need a clear university level, but also national level and Nordic level guidelines for tackling harassment. We need to make sure that funding stays independent of political combats to secure autonomous, diverse research. And we need recognition and restoration of the value of scientific knowledge and academic freedom to fight populist claims that are very common nowadays. And we also need legislation that would protect freedom of speech against hate speech and coordinated harassment that academics encounter. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Tuija. We move on to Iceland, and we'll have Auður Önnu Magnúsdóttir, who is from Icelandic Women's Rights Association, and she will be presenting us an Icelandic so I'm losing all of my words here. Icelandic perspective, that is what I was looking for. So Auður, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for this great work. I particularly liked how many open-ended quotes from the questions were included in the report. It deepened it and made it a very real report. It increased the connections that we felt, or I felt, to my colleagues in the Nordic countries. I was a bit surprised that only half of respondents, a little bit more than half, reported the opposition in the form of threats or harassment. I thought it was a lot more. Maybe that's just me being so cynical, but I thought the situation was worse. But it also depends on what kind of organizations, government bodies, and academics answered. And perhaps people have normalized the situation of what threats and harassments mean. It becomes like an everyday thing. So people just think, well, this is just normal. I'm not going to report that this was threats or harassment. That sounds very serious, but it may happen to us every day, especially us in the civil society. I thought also it was interesting in the report that even though civil society reported the highest impact of opposition on their mental health, they did to a very low degree report that they altered their messaging tactics or work. And this shows how resilient the civil society in the Nordic countries is and how determined they are to create a better society for all of us. And they're very determined in improving society. So despite all of those threats, they were least likely to change their tactics or work. The photo here is from last year's Pride. I just wanted to show that the Icelandic women's rights movement, which is a very broad and shows a lot of solidarity. We took part as a whole in the Gay Pride. And what you see there, the animal there, it's Miss Young Iceland. And it's a reference to old feministic activism in Iceland where Icelandic feminists entered a real-life cow into a beauty pageant. And she marched at Gay Pride 2025. Next slide, please. I just wanted to discuss a little bit examples from Iceland when it comes to threats and harassment. Young people in Iceland, especially from the queer community, report increased violence offline and online compared to just a few years ago. We see very clearly increased racism in Iceland. We have an anti-gender political party. They will probably not agree that they are anti-gender, but they surely are. They're receiving 10 to 20% of the votes in municipal and parliamentary elections. 64% of Icelandic men believe gender equality has already been reached. And the anti-gender rhetoric in public discussion is increasing rapidly. For example, regarding women's role primarily as mothers, and everything else that women are interested in or want to achieve comes secondary. Of the dangers of gender studies, especially informing younger people about gender equality, gender studies in the broader sense. And lastly, of the right, which is a new trend in the discussion that I've seen, the right to not have to see the gay pride flag, which is very strange. Next slide, please. I also wanted to talk a little bit about examples from my organizations. We have received formal threats of legal action. Our organization has received those threats through formal channels from men's rights groups and also informal. In one case of a formal threat, it was because of an article published in our yearly magazine on domestic violence committed by men, and the men's rights organizations wanted the article removed from the magazine. We have also seen harassment at events, which is very troubling. Last year, our organization's yearly gender congress was invaded by anti-gender activists that verbally attacked participants, distributed flyers with anti-trans propaganda, vandalized the venue's bathroom that we were renting, and a participant vehicle was vandalized with stickers that was very hard to get off. His vehicle was it's called a moped in Swedish. I don't know, Vespa. I don't know the English word for that. And at this event, the anti-gender people filmed us without us knowing. They had like a body cam in a button like this. And we didn't know they were filming us, and then they published the material online. Fortunately, we didn't embarrass ourselves, but still it was very uncomfortable to know that someone had done that. Of course, like every organization trying to improve society, the Icelandic Women's Rights Association experiences a lot of online harassment with numerous hateful comments on our social media posts, often by the same profiles. These comments are derogatory and abusive, and we delete those, and often we ban the profiles. The little bit less hateful comments are stating that we are, as an organization, are failing women by our intersectional approach, especially when it comes to trans rights. And sometimes we reply to this if people have serious concerns or questions that we think are worth answering. And some of the comments, like claiming that gender equality has gone too far because we have a female president, female prime minister, female bishop, we reply to those. I would also like to end with harassment and pushback from people in power, which I think, even if it is not as violent as the other threats and harassment, it is much more serious, because people in power need to realize that they are actually people in power, and when they say something and do something against individuals or small organizations, it has a lot of impact. There is an MP of the anti-gender party in Iceland who has, for example, taken a video of me and written a long, misleading and very rude social media post on his own platform. And this post received a lot of likes and comments, and some of them were really troubling and very hateful and threatening against me and our organization. And I would also like to mention that ministers from right-wing political parties, but not the anti-gender one, because they are not in a part of the government, they write opinion pieces about our organization and discuss persons within the organization, naming them and telling everyone that we are not smart. And I think when ministers do that, they really need to consider who they are targeting. I think that is it for me, but thanks again for a great report. And I think it's important to discuss how we're going to battle all these threats. And these are, as has been said before, threats to democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Auður. Troubling news from Iceland as well. Thank you to all of the brilliant speakers. Now I have the privilege to have a discussion with you, and we'll move on to that next. We have Julian, Cristian and Tuija here in the studio with me, and Auður there through online connections, but I can see you sipping your coffee, which is very comfortable for me as well. So thank you. I would first maybe like to start with a question which is very general, and all of you have touched upon it already. But how can we ensure that gender equality continues to be advanced in the Nordic countries, despite this opposition that we always talk about being global, but we have found out that it's very, very Nordic as well. So do you have any good pieces of advice here for us. And if you lift your hand, I will know who wants to take the floor. Auður, can you start, please?
Yeah, I would just like to mention that Nordic Ministers of Equality had a side event at the last CSW, the United Nations Women's Conference, the 70th one in March, where they emphasized that gender equality was good for families. And I think it's very important that we in the Nordics, we show that our social model, where we have high gender equality, also very high standard of living, very high welfare standards, and all the lists that are measuring how societies are doing, we are at the top. And we're also at the top of gender equality. So this connection is very important to make, and also not allow the anti-gender movement to steal the family values rhetoric that is ours. We have shown that families are stronger when we have gender equality. So I think that was a very important event, and I think this is something that we can give to the world.
Thank you. And Cristian.
Yes, perhaps if I am to emphasize something that I lift up also in my presentation earlier, I would say that we need to not throw away what we have built and that has turned to be very effective and very successful. And in here I would like again to go back to this issue that our societies are built on a high level of trust. We trust our institutions. And in here perhaps I would like to include part of this institutional framework, all of us. So all of us, we are doing our small little bit in the way that we know best. I mean, academics, they do their academic work. Civil society organizations, they are doing their work. The governments are implementing these things and they see that everything functions well. And if I would, perhaps the easiest way to see the way forward is do not destroy what is already working very well, preserve it, enforce it and strengthen it, because we see that there is a continuous pressure from outside in particular, but also from within, to destroy these things, to damage the legitimacy of academics, to damage the trust that we have built for so long in the organizations that we want to collaborate with, and always using the social media rather as mediums for sowing distrust instead of trying to reach and to use these opportunities to connect closer.
Thank you. Tuija.
Yes, I would like to continue on what you said, and from the perspective of academia, I would emphasize that we need, because we are under attack, and that is, I suppose, in many ways coordinated attack, and especially, as I said in my speech, against gender studies scholars. This has to be sort of acknowledged, and we have to sort of proudly continue what we do, and that is like sort of keep up working on societal issues, and like humanities and social sciences we must appreciate them ourselves, and we must emphasize that everybody should understand the value of these fields of research. It's not only about like instrumental technological sort of sciences, but we also need to cherish these fields that really explain why the Nordic countries are good in family values and in gender equality and so on. So I think that it's really important to emphasize that.
Julian.
I think one thing that the study didn't specifically look at, where we didn't do any policy recommendations. We were curious and interested in knowing how the people on the ground and in ministries and academics, how they themselves face this kind of opposition. Do they face it? And if so, what forms does it take? But I think the results show that there are definitely steps that should be taken. It's an alarming concern of what level of violence different kinds of organizations and agents are facing, threats, and also the dropping out from public discussion, from public representation. It creates a strange kind of double bind where professionally you're expected to comment on social and political issues, but when you do it, you risk your safety or your family's safety. And defamation attempts, smear campaigns, they're very damaging, and also, of course, targeting funding institutions. So I think there needs to be better mechanisms for preventive measures. And then another takeaway definitely that I think is that opposition to gender equality is not a marginal fringe phenomena. It's at the center of destabilizing Nordic democracies. And that's why it should be taken seriously as a hybrid security concern. And there could be Nordic societies are also strong in our unity and cooperation for strengthening civil society resilience and crisis resilience also against hybrid attacking. And finally, of course, taking seriously foreign funding streams and possible foreign influence, which we didn't, of course, look at because we were just looking at the experiences and responses from these organizations. And then finally, of course, securing funding for academic institutions. The academics that responded to this survey weren't gender studies scholars only. They represented all kinds of interdisciplinary disciplines, and most of them worked in different kinds of multiple fields, political science, anthropology, social science. But yeah, I think like one concern is the taking seriously that one of the strong elements of Nordic societies is a strong and thriving civil society. They function as the messengers between grass level work and better policy. And I think it's like for all of our safety and also, of course, freedom and rights to protect our Nordic resilience. So those are some takeaways that I think can definitely be worked on. And I agree with Cristian and Tuija also on your comments.
I think there's a lot of very praising comments in the chat for the report and for the work that has been done. There's also a question about, is there something that surprised you in the report, something that caught your eye and was surprising to any of you, but of course Julian maybe first because you were the one conducting the survey. Or if anybody else wants to go first and let Julian think about it a little bit if you want to.
I can say one positive takeaway is that it seems that Nordic institutions protect government officials a little bit better from this than NGOs and academics who kind of like faced the harshest pushback. Mm. But what was surprising was that when government officials responded that they haven't, for example, encountered this kind of opposition directly, then when there were follow-up discussion and follow-up questions, they still reported funding cuts, pressure to work with different concepts than what are agreed upon in international agreements and ratified gender equality work, for example, regarding women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, and also pushback against gender-affirming care, misinformation concerning trans rights. So I think that was a bit surprising that how it's possible that certain people and agencies and groups do not perceive that this is actually a form of discursive pushback when you are working under stress with limited resources and under pressure to change terminology that's actually ratified in international human rights documents. So those are two perhaps surprising results.
Tuija.
Yes, what surprised me was that because I've been reading about the anti-gender movement, like basically that you were actually talking about the Kuhar and Paternotte reports and so on that deal with this mobilization in southern European countries and like Catholic countries. And what surprised me was that the message that, or the ideology that is now, that they try to sort of implement in the Nordic countries, it differs from that of the southern European countries, because there in the south and in the central European countries, which are mostly Catholic countries, it's obvious that sort of the point is that we need to protect the sort of the family that consists of a husband and a wife and children, and the wife must stay at home. So stay-at-home wives and like the traditional role of genders is emphasized. We know that in the Nordic countries it's not the case. It's not happening here because we have had this model of like two paychecks in the family. So women have been also like in the working life for so long. So they have had to think of another sort of ideological strong message, and that was actually that you brought up the sort of the weak situation of men and boys, and this is something that we are now hearing constantly, that there's something wrong with the society that doesn't defend men and boys. So the very big trouble about the men and boys, and that is something that I wouldn't have expected, but that was quite a strong element of the survey results.
Yeah, Cristian.
I mean, if I make just a short intervention, perhaps if we zoom out at the European level, it has been having perhaps a more humbling effect, because for a very long time we thought that, well, in Northern Europe we are kind of insulated from this sort of developments, and we thought that, well, you know, we have gender equality. I mean, in countries like Sweden we had entire political spectrum, you know, declaring that they have a feminist perspective on politics, pushing for emancipatory gender equality and so on and so forth. But I think this report shows that even in such countries in which we take for granted, unfortunately, these endeavors, anti-gender campaigns can be still articulated, but they come out, as Tuija was mentioning, as well as Julian, they manifest perhaps slightly differently. Certain actors perhaps take a step back while others are stepping in. However, I would argue that the constellation of actors that are pushing for these transformations are more or less the same. It's just some take a stronger initiative in some contexts than in others. And as Tuija mentioned, I think this is the very problematic issue, how connecting the question of gender equality with issues of men's rights and young boys.
And I also think that even though the message is different in different countries, the basic message is very similar globally. If we look at what is happening in any country, you can see similar messages in all of our countries, unfortunately. Yeah. Tuija was already mentioning some differences between the Nordic countries comparing to the rest of Europe. But based on this report, do you see the situation being different in the Nordic countries than in the rest of Europe? Any one of you? Tuija already mentioned one difference.
Perhaps I've been studying comparatively both Northern Europe as well as Eastern Europe. So one of the patterns that came out quite clearly is, as I was saying, the role certain institutions have taken in mobilizing anti-gender campaigns in the Eastern European context. I've been researching Hungary as well as Romania, and I could see how there the issue of equal rights had manifested, particularly attacking the LGBTQI community, the issue of equal marriage rights that has not even been legislated in the Romanian context, whilst, for instance, in the Finnish context, that is a battle, if you wish, for the community that has been won, that is more or less accepted. However, there are still points of divergence and questioning of the gender equality endeavors. However, I would say that in here, the strong point is that we are departing from a high level of trust and expertise, in which scholars are still, even though they are in battle, they are still trusted for their contribution that they can make to the Nordic societies. And I think this is something that we can use as a departing point for strengthening rather than weakening further our societies.
There's another question in the chat about are there notable differences between the three groups, the civil society organizations, the academia, and the government, in terms of the types types of opposition to gender equality work or the prevalence of the opposition to gender equality work. Julian already mentioned something about that from the governments, but how do you see it?
Yeah, it seems that there are some differences in the kind of like the way opposition, like we could hear from Auður Magnúsdóttir's presentation that this is a very typical example of how NGOs working on the ground face direct threats of violence and streaming and filming, live streaming without permission, which is a form of intimidation. But also one statistics that came up is that NGOs reported more sexual harassment. And whereas academics reported a little bit more of online harassment, smear campaigns, and doxing, and legal threats. So these kind of defamation campaigns where there are something is taken out of context and they're being discredited, and their job security is being threatened, for example. So there are some differences in the ways that these organizations were facing it. And then, of course, one thing that came up was that all of these different kind of sectors faced specifically anti-trans rhetoric and pushback. And different kinds of misinformation and abuse of different kinds of ways of targeting these organizations, even when they didn't necessarily have anything to do with trans rights. So I think one way that the Nordic context differs a little bit from the rest of Europe is that because we have such high trust in our institutions and high trust in medical expertise and doctors, it seems that one thing that should be examined further is there a possible link between international movements and taking advantage of medical expertise and then using medical expertise in anti-trans and also this kind of like targeting of gender affirming care, which is something that needs deeper investigation. But it came up in the open responses across all of these sectors that this is one area where also these organizations and different kinds of institutions need more help, how to cope with it and how to address it and when not to address it. Because this is also really important to know. When should you respond? How should you respond? When do you not comment? You don't need to engage in all of these kind of rhetoric. And of course, it's important to debate. It's important to have proper discussion. But from my personal experience, for example, as an academic, I've experienced almost very similar kinds of all of these that I saw, that I have personally experienced them in my career. And not a single time has any one of these attempts invited me to a panel. Let's debate this. Let's discuss this. I'm up for it. I can debate. I can discuss. As long as we respect each other and we're safe from violence. But no invitations. It's just this kind of like very sticky kind of rhetoric where you need to know when to exit, when to respond, how to respond, and how not to do it. My response went a little bit outside of the question, but yeah, there were some differences in depending on the level of gender expertise, their experience, the respondents' experiences changed and shifted a little bit.
What about where there is significant differences between the Nordic countries? In the report, you don't name countries, but as such. But did you notice differences?
Well, I think like Tuija responded earlier that one of the tendencies seems that it's very similar across the region because the countries themselves are quite similar in terms of demographics and multi-parliamentary systems, and of course there are differences, but yeah, there wasn't notable differences in the responses. I think one of the results is that it seems that it's quite unified, these experiences.
And if I may add to that, I think that it sort of shows that there is this sort of global that this ideology is brought from outside the Nordic countries, and they think that the Nordic countries are very similar. So there's no point in doing like different campaigns in each country because they are like pretty much the same. So that's why we are having these effects, and maybe Southern European countries have like different sort of attacks against democracy in there.
Yeah. And Auður brought up the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN this March, where the Nordic Council of Ministers did have the ministers panel on family and family policy, because it is true what you said, that we have the best family policies in the world as well. So gender equality and the best for families must not really be fighting against each other. There's a question. About that it's not new to the people who are working with these issues, and somebody is asking that what can we do about it on the floor, not on the floor but on the ground. Wrong word, same in Finnish but different in English. Do you have any advice on what the people working on the ground can do about this? Julian looks like you might have an answer, but
maybe you can respond.
Auður, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what is meant by people on the ground. I just assume that's the general public. One very tiny thing that you can always do is, if you see a hateful comment or someone is attacking activists, gender equality activists, especially trans people, they get a lot of attacks, at least in Iceland now, on social media. Just defend them. Just say, I disagree. Also, like everything that you see from activists, it is very easy, but it does matter. And just comment if an activist that you actually agree with is stating something on social media. Just say, I agree. It's a very, very small thing, and it helps a lot. I can also say one interesting, very Icelandic threat that I received in my previous job as an environmental activist was a magical rune that I got sent in the mail, and I got cursed by a magical rune. So it was like a letter that was sent in the mail. So it was a curse.
Anybody else do you have any wisdom for people on the ground? What can we do about it? I think, of course, me as a government official, I always trust the laws, and we have, I think, very good laws in the Nordic countries. But I think that we always seem to have to remind people about the laws and about the gender equality law and the laws and the non-discrimination laws that we have in the Nordic countries, because these laws are saying that we do have to promote gender equality. We have to work against any type of discrimination, and sometimes it's good to also remind the discussion about that. Julian.
There's a section in the report where the respondents were also asked what do they think are best measures to help, and one of them was better legal protection. We have, for good reasons in the Nordic countries, legal protection against, for example, incitement of hate and violence and racism. They need to be better understood and implied, and reporting mechanisms need to be better. Also, when reports are made, police need to be better educated about taking seriously these kinds of reports. So those improving the systems, like Cristian said, that there are. But then perhaps one takeaway, if the person asking this was operating on the ground, whether it's an academic or somebody who works in the NGO, is I would say, if possible, try to network with peers and arrange live events. If you're not in the same country, then have a Zoom connection or something. Stay close to people who you can share these experiences with, because the social media algorithms, they work to amplify toxic, negative hate and these kind of emotions that are very stressful. And they can give the picture, like the person said, that this is nothing new for us. But I think the resilience is built from staying close to people that you can share these experiences with and not staying alone. And then also remembering that this is slow work. It's very easy to destroy something that somebody has built, but it takes much more time to, build permanent structures and continue with it. So keep speaking up, use your platforms whenever you can, and if you cannot, try to delegate to other people, and let's stay together in this. And also in terms of Nordic collaboration, possibly with the Baltic countries, I would like to see Nordic and Baltic cooperation on these issues to strengthen this kind of work, and staying together despite our differences, because the differences is also our strength.
Thank you, Julian. That was very well put, and that's a good ending for our discussion. We are now at the end of the launch event. I would like to thank all of you speakers. This has been a very, very interesting conversation and a very, very interesting report indeed. So thank you again for the Nordic Council of Ministers for sponsoring the report. And a big thank you for all the participants and the lively chat discussion. I hope that you will be able to read the full report and make use of its findings. And once again, a reminder that you can access the report by scanning the QR code. That's all from me and all from us. Let's continue pushing for progress together. Thank you.